What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So, in this video, I want to talk about Ronald Reagan, okay, and why he is one of my least favorite presidents of all times. Now, I did do a video talking about him a long time ago. I think this was back during the Black Screen Team years. Back with a group of us, black conscious YouTubers, would talk about different issues, sports and social commentary, but we used to use a black screen on our videos. There was no images. But that was like 2011, 2012, maybe 2013 when we did that. But anyway, talk about Ronald Reagan for a second, man. I know he's one of the most popular presidents of all times, and he's his name evokes sunny optimism, and a time when the country went back to being proud of itself after the malaise and the terrible times of the 70s. And I'm old enough to remember Ronald Reagan. All right, I was born under Jimmy Carter, but I remember Ronald Reagan, the latter stages of his presidency, the second term. Not gonna lie, I look at the 80s and 90s with optimism compared to today. But most people look at their childhood with optimism compared to the realities of adulthood in some ways, right? You're younger, you still got your whole life ahead of you, whereas many of us are middle-aged, half our lives are over, if not more than that. So yeah, But anyway, man, when you really look at Ronald Reagan, man, it's a lot to not like about this person, all right? Set aside the audio of him and then President Richard Nixon referring to visiting African dignitaries as monkeys. Okay? Set that aside. That just goes to show you how he looked at black people. All right? And he always seemed uncomfortable around minorities or black people. Right? And people would say, well, he's not racist. He's just a person who is not used to being around minorities, but he doesn't have a racist bone in his body. Yeah, right. His administration's foreign policy and domestic policy screams racism in so many different ways, man. Right? First of all, we already know that he supported apartheid, which is a fancy way of saying that he supported that South Africa remained in white minority control and that blacks would be subjected to secondary class citizenship. All right? Most of his administration's policies toward African countries or Africa in general were backwater 1940s and 50s style thinking when it come to African leaders. They thought Africa was backwards, and they thought Africa should still be colonized. And when it comes to that region of the country, the Reagan administration didn't have much interest. All right? Then you look at the fact that in Africa, and even more so in South America and Central America, under the guise of fighting communism, the Reagan administration supported right-wing dictatorships, which of course is anathema to communism. But these dictatorships is ridiculous. These dictatorships didn't believe at all in human rights. So, okay, yeah, they're not communists, but they're just as bad, if not worse, because they didn't believe in human rights at all. And a lot of these right wing dictatorships, in particular in Central America, that they supported government funding, and they dealt with these people. They actually gave them monies, weapons, and these right wing terroristic governments would oppress many citizens. But the difference is, hey, these citizens were brown and black. So who gives a fuck? As long as strategically you guys are against communism, which suits the people who back my administration, and more importantly, people that back the party, Republican majority, that made up his cabinet and made up the supporters of his administration, and appease the wealthy donors, and appease the wealthy class that supported his administration. All right? So that's one thing that bothered me about him. Then you look at the fact that on the domestic side, people always gave Ronald Reagan so much credit for the revitalization of our economy, when in reality, this is why I always praise Jimmy Carter so much. And I'm glad Jimmy Carter is still around. To me, the president can only affect the economy on the margins. Okay? What really brought the economy back was a decision made in 1979. Okay? And that decision was when Jimmy Carter hired Paul Volcker to be the Fed chairman. It's the Federal Reserve that has more of an effect overall on the economy than any other real entity. But Paul Volcker was the Fed chairman, later succeeded by Alan Greensburg. I think that's his name, right? Alice Greenberg. Anyway, Paul Volcker was the one whose policies led to the longest economic expansion at the time in this country's history, from the 80s going into the 1990s. But the decision to hire Paul Volcker was made by Jimmy Carter. But the thing is, these decisions, these policies, and decisions to cut rates and you know, different various things they did to try to stimulate the economy, these things were seen initially. The benefits of it aren't seen immediately. They're seen years later. So a decision that, say, Jimmy Carter made in 1978-79, guess what? You're not seeing the benefits of it until 5 or 6 years later. But guess who's getting all the credit? Ronald Reagan. And for those who think I'm being biased against Republicans, well, Bill Clinton got so much credit for the economic boom of the 1990s and boom of the 1990s, but a lot of that came from the tax increase, the massive tax increase that George Bush signed off on in 1990, George H.W. Bush, right? Now that tax increase was very, very unpopular with George Bush's party. Remember, George Bush ran for president. Remember when he was nominated in '88, he famously said that he was going to push back as far as new taxes with the Democratic Congress. Remember, he said, they're going to push me and I'm going to say no. They're going to push me and I'm going to say no. They're going to push and I'm going to say, read my lips, no new taxes. But when he broke his promise, he already had issues with securing the conservative Reagan wing of the party, but that hurt. And ultimately, Bush lost re-election, but Clinton got the credit when the economy began to make a B turn a U-turn, excuse me, and go back to prosperity. Then, look, other things with Reagan. The homeless situation. I can't remember the exact numbers anymore, but I think, if I remember correctly, when Jimmy Carter left office, I think there were something around 20 million homeless people in this country. There were 20 million homeless people in this country. When Reagan left office, there were over 40 million homeless people in this country. Now, does that sound right? You would think, well, wait a minute. If the economy was booming, why were there more homeless people? Well, because that's the thing about Reaganomics. You saw the biggest gap between the poor and the rich that we've ever seen at that time. It's just gotten worse. In the 1970s, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies were making $100,000, $200,000 a year. That's a lot of money back in those days. Maybe $400,000, $500,000 the top. But in the 1980s, through greed, through deregulation, these guys were making millions and millions of dollars per year. Golden parachutes of $10 million and salaries of $20 million. But the poor got poorer. You stopped seeing increases in salaries. Even though inflation disappeared by the mid-1980s, you still didn't see a benefit from the so-called trickle-down economics to those who were poor. And ultimately, people started struggling, and the poor got poorer and poorer and poorer. And also, another group of people that struggled during the Reagan years were farmers. Then you saw the biggest knock on Ronald Reagan was his lack of empathy and heart. This disease that is so easily treatable today, it was called GRID at first. Then it was called the gay plague. Then ultimately, I think it was back in 1983 or 84, it finally received its name that it's called now, HIV/AIDS. This started off as a minor disease at first, but the Reagan administration didn't talk about it because they saw it as, hey, this disease is only affecting gay people and black people initially. So who cares? Who gives a fuck? But it wasn't until it affected people who he could relate to that he started giving even two fucks about it. First one being Rock Hudson, the first of his entertainment buddies that he could relate to. Then, of course, you had Liberace, then other people. If I'm not mistaken, the first time that the Reagan administration even mentioned HIV/AIDS was in 1987. But by that time, the epidemic or the pandemic, or, well, I don't think you would call it a pandemic, but the epidemic was in full force. Millions of people had died. Tens of millions had been infected. And since then, I think over 40 million people have been infected by HIV worldwide. So I'm telling you, man, it's just so many different things. The Iran-Contra thing, that's just out there. That's another thing I could mention, but it's already out there. You know what I'm saying? The fact that they agreed to arms in exchange for hostages, whatever. That just goes to show you the corruption of the Reagan administration, and not to mention the fact that their policies were just racist toward black people. They cut food stamps. They cut a lot of essential programs. They cut, I guess what you would call welfare, if they call it that, whatever. They cut a lot of programs that were meant to help people who were more needy. And while I do agree that the administration should have increased defense spending, I just thought that the Reagan administration was rather heartless, man, when it came to how they dealt with people who were poor. And when you look at the Republican Party, the 1980s, even though Nixon started it with the Southern strategy, the 1980s was the culmination in the Republican Party catering to racists. When you look at the fact that Ronald Reagan launched his 1980 campaign in the same city where those missing civil rights workers were beaten and killed, the same city. So, I mean, it is what it is, man. That's just always been my knock on Reagan, man. Then you got to go all the way back to when he was governor of California, right? When he was governor of California, this is a guy that supposedly is for, back then, he was a big gun rights advocate. Except for when it pertained to the Black Panthers. Then all of a sudden, he signed legislation that, in the state that tried to affect people who, of color, or people who weren't in power, who wanted to register to have handguns. I think they passed some shit where if you had a record or whatever, but some shit they really only enforced on minorities. See, it was different when you're black, though. And ironically, Ronald Reagan turned into a gun. What's the word I'm looking for? Ironically, after he got shot, all of a sudden he was for gun rights, gun restrictions. All of a sudden, then, after he got shot. But anyway, that's all I gotta say about that, man. Tell me what you guys think.